Does somebody in this country realistically think you're going to get back Aksai Chin? That one morning Xi Jinping will wake up and say, "Oh, India, I apologize for the evil perfidy of Mao. Here's Aksai Chin back, and here's all the territory around Galwan that we took." Anybody who believes that is naive.
Welcome to the Gist on Stat News Global. I'm Ramananda Sengupta. Our very special guest today is Amit Gupta, Senior Advisor, Forum of Federations in Ottawa, formerly faculty of the US Air Force Air War College, and he works on international security, pop culture, and politics. He has also coached the War College soccer team. And for those of you who missed it, I recommend that you look at his earlier show on with us. I'm sure you'll find it extremely stimulating. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Gupta. It's a pleasure to have you with us again.
Thank you, Ramananda. And I do want to point out one disclaimer to your audience. While I was an enthusiastic soccer coach, I was a very bad soccer coach. If I had been coaching in the English Premier League, I would have been fired mid-season. So,
I'm glad they didn't hire you.
Yeah, I'm glad I had a daytime job, as they say, in the United States.
Yep. So, today we are going to be discussing Modi's last term, Prime Minister Modi's last term in terms of foreign policy, the hits and misses perhaps in that. And then we'll be looking at the main key sort of countries that we're dealing with, the US, China, Russia. So to begin with, if you were to look at Prime Minister Modi's foreign policy during his last term, what would you sort of say were his main places where he did a good job and where he may have done a better job?
I think the two best things that happened were, firstly, staying out of the mess called Ukraine. There was a lot of pressure from the EU and the United States that India should be part of this. India very sensibly said no, and it reaped the benefits, whether it was cheap oil, whether it was being able to navigate its own foreign policy. And my own feeling is that both the Europeans and the United States are going to rue the economic consequences and the military strategic consequences of Ukraine. So good for India. The second one, which I'm actually very proud of, is vaccine maitri. Because if you look at that, while the US and the West were hoarding vaccine supplies and raw materials, India went out and gave it to people all the way from Antigua, which means Viv Richards probably got a co-vaccine, to countries like Bangladesh and so on. And the fact that India did that in many cases gratis is very, very credible. Not credible, creditable. Until it stopped. And it stopped because the US cut off the supply of raw materials to India, which we'll talk about in US-India relations. So I thought those were the two things which I would be boasting about because India did well. Where the shortfalls came, number one, is how you deal with China. And it seems to me that there's no sense of imagination left on how to deal with China. The positions are very rigid, and we are losing out as a country for one very simple reason, that China is the economic behemoth in Asia. So if you look at it, China has $870 odd billion of trade with ASEAN. It has about $780 billion of trade with the European Union. It has $670 billion of trade with the United States, and it's about $300 billion with the Japanese and the Koreans. And the Japanese, the Koreans, and the Chinese hate each other. But the one thing they do say is nothing gives us greater joy than to make money off our enemies. So $300 billion of trade is pretty good. India's with China's, what, 130 billion or so, if I'm not wrong? There's a long way to go on that. And what all these countries say is we have valid territorial disputes with China, but that doesn't mean we can't have a trading arrangement with China. I think China's a problem. It has to be worked out. The other problem is essentially too many expectations with the relationship with the United States. So I would say those would be the two major misses. The minor miss is you still have an unruly neighborhood, right? And if you take out Bangladesh and to a lesser extent Sri Lanka, India doesn't have the kind of sense of amity, if I may put it that way, in the region, which would allow you to expand your foreign policy interests, have greater economic cooperation, so on.
You mentioned China and trade, but I remember one of the issues that seems to be a bother is that the balance of trade is very heavily skewed in China's favor. But that applies to almost all countries that trade with China.
Except parts of the EU.
Possibly, yes. But how does that actually impact relationships, the economic relationship? How is that a problem?
It's a problem because India sits there saying greater reciprocity. US also does that, by the way, which is why Trump put all those tariffs on China. But to me, when I talk to Indian manufacturers, they say the problem isn't China, the problem is India. Because until your goods leave the gate of your factory, you're competitive with China. The minute they go out and all the state and local taxes and national taxes get slapped on, you suddenly become non-competitive with the Chinese. Right. So if you can solve that, India can actually compete better and probably sell more also around the world.
How would you solve that? Why is it that nobody's managed to solve it so far?
Oh, I wish I could answer that question. There's too many middlemen. Look, I'll give you a very simple example. Walmart wanted to buy directly from farmers and sell to people in their mega stores. That never went through because you would have cut out an entire group of middlemen who make their living by moving goods and services from one town to the other. So instead you have this awfully inflated food system, and a lot of your food rots. We are one of those few countries where 1/3 of our food just rots away because we don't know how to store it, we don't know how to move it. Yeah.
I mean, I remember a Chinese gentleman telling me that, perhaps it helps if cheap labor is not the only thing, but they do have a very disciplined labor and a very subsidized kind of a labor force which allows them to produce things at a much cheaper thing, which democratic countries perhaps find it difficult to do. Would that be a correct assessment?
Look, what the Chinese have is a good middle manager category. You need middle managers with certain skills which are beyond those of an assembly line worker. And if you look at the iPhone today in India, the iPhone manufacture is being done by Indians, but the middle managers, the supervisors, are Chinese. And that's the case with a number of companies. In fact, the government of India has not been giving visas to Chinese middle managers, and that's been stymieing the efforts of these companies to produce and export. So something has to be figured out in that direction. The other thing the Chinese are good at, and you and I have talked about this before, is the Chinese don't sit there and say reciprocity and it must happen under all terms, and sometimes you can't do reciprocity. What they say is look at the big picture. And the best example of this is the aviation industry. Both Southeast Asian airlines and Southwest, meaning the Gulf state airlines, want to have more flights to India. And the Indian government's taken the position, well, if they have one flight, we must have one flight. Your carriers can't do it. And they won't be able to do it for maybe another 10 years. Now, what the Chinese do, and this is a personal story, when I left to study in the United States, there was one KLM flight to Amsterdam, one Air France flight to Paris, and one Lufthansa flight to Frankfurt every day.
Okay,
now 36 years later, there's one KLM flight to Paris, one Lufthansa flight, one Air France flight. In the same time, I went to China in the 90s. There was 2 flights a day from LA to Shanghai. There are now 20 flights. And the Chinese do not care. The Chinese aren't sitting there and saying reciprocity. They're saying you're bringing in loads of tourists, you're bringing in loads of businessmen. Welcome to China. So you have to be a bit more imaginative about this instead of sitting there and saying, oh, how do we compete with the Chinese? Play their game.
There was this gentleman I know who used to run a PLA think tank at one time, and we've been in touch for a long time. So one of the arguments that he made, and I suspect, I'm not very comfortable with that narrative, but what he said was that if India wants to be the factory of the world, China has no problems at all. because they are moving on to artificial intelligence and robotics and all that stuff. So
Yeah.
but you said India lacks two things. One is the killer instinct, wherein you say everything else can go to hell. I just want to do this, and that's how it's done.
Right.
And two, that we're too caught up in international laws and things like that, because of which we are worried about stealing IP, intellectual property things and all that. Is if you want to become the factory, you cannot think along those lines. Is a cheap labor is not good enough because any other country can outdo you in terms of cheap labor. So he says that's not good enough. You have to have that killer instinct, and B, you have to be totally ruthless. Would you agree with that assessment?
Look, I partly agree with it. I think cheap labor only works up to a point. Mexico got the Volkswagen production line. They were producing such bad Jettas that they pulled the production line out of Mexico and moved it to China. So cheap labor is necessary, but it's not sufficient. The other thing is, India is pretty good at stealing too. I mean, if you know anybody in drugs and pharmaceuticals, ask them about some of the things where India has played some very dodgy games. And by India, I mean Indian companies have played some very dodgy games with things like patents and so on. Classic one was Valium, which was the tranquilizer, which was made by an Indian company who took the patent and tweaked it a bit and were able to sell it in India as something else.
Oh.
Yeah, so you have things like that. It's killer instincts certainly, but the thing with the Chinese is the Chinese think big. They have ambition, vision, and resources. India doesn't think big. And that would be my main gripe with Indian corporations. And I'll give you an example. 10 years ago, nobody knew the company called BYD. Today, BYD is the biggest electric vehicle company. It's not Elon Musk with his $54 billion
going to,
paycheck.
Beat Elon Musk at his game, I'm told.
They are, because they're making good cars. And Teslas are very pretty, but I don't need a pretty car in New Delhi. I need a functional car in New Delhi. Okay? So they think that way. I went to Tierra del Fuego in Argentina, which is right at the bottom of the world, 2 years ago. The only car dealerships there, were Chery, which is Chinese, and Hyundai, which is Korean. No American, no European. Because they're like, who goes to Tierra del Fuego? Well, you know who goes to it. And Brazil now is awash with Chinese cars. So they have been able to do things because they've reached out where other people don't want to go.
Since we are on the subject of China, I mean, let's continue with China. Another argument that I've heard is that China imports iron from India,
Yes.
and sells us things like nail clippers and locks and things like that at a very subsidized rate, which the local manufacturers cannot compete against. Why is it that the Indian manufacturers cannot do the same thing at that same cost?
Look, there's two parts to this. This is not a new strategy. This is how the Japanese killed the American electronics industry. They went in and sold televisions at 15% less than what Kenwood and all these other people were selling, and they wiped it out. The American manufacturers were not willing to cut their profits in order to deal with the Japanese. So that's part of the problem in India. And the other thing is, we're not a true capitalist system. If you're a true capitalist system, you say, I make 500,000 cars in 2024. In 2025, I should make 750,000.
Right.
You're quite satisfied with your 500,000 cars. And that's where the killer instinct part, I think, becomes important. And then you have to look for a global market, and you have to raise your standards, which is the main complaint about India. India is a textile exporter, for example, is the first batch is wonderful of exports. From the second and third, it starts to decline precipitously. So you have to maintain standards. You have to be able to compete with other people. You have to be willing to undercut. So all this requires a certain type of mentality, number one. And you don't mock customers. So if you go in Africa, it's full of Chinese cell phones, as is India, by the way.
Right.
You're not sitting there saying, if I'm going to sell my product, it'll only go to Europe, because that's a tough market to get into. So I would leave it at that, yeah. And I'll add one more thing, sorry. The Chinese have put a very heavy emphasis on education. India has pushed education into a downward spiral.
I agree.
You know, and I'll give you a simple example. I have a friend who was a senior government servant who retired and is now working for a company proofreading and correcting the English of the reports written by their 25-year-olds.
Oh.
Yeah. Now, why would you have to hire a senior retired government servant and pay him more than you're paying the 25-year-old? The 25-year-old can't write 5 consecutive sentences in English.
Okay.
And you want to be a global player. If you're working with multinationals and so on, well, then you've got to be able to speak English fluently, you've got to be able to write English in a proper manner, so on. You're not doing that. The Chinese are. And this is where the Chinese ambition, vision, resources is amazing. In 2003, you know, there's a whole bunch of these surveys which are done on the top 500 universities in the world. And 17 or 18 of them are in the West. Mainly it's in the United States and a couple in Europe. Back in 2003, when I first started tracking this, the Chinese had 3 universities in 500. Today they have 53.
Wow, okay.
Yeah. So look at how the progression. And if you look at the applications for patents, 3 countries beat everybody else hands down. China, Japan, South Korea. These are the 3 countries which file the most patents for inventions in the world now. It's not Netherlands, it's not the United States, it's none of the typical nations which used to engage in a scientific industrial base. Instead, what it is the Chinese are coming up rapidly. And remember, the first thing that happens in the West is, if any non-Western country does it, they've stolen the tech. It's not that they have smart people who may have made the tech. And I'll give you 2 examples there. Every time a non-Western country tests a nuclear weapon, oh, they stole it from somewhere.
Right.
Now, when I wrote my PhD, I interviewed Raja Ramanna. And I asked Raja Ramanna, why did you go into nuclear physics? And he said, when he was at the University of London, he was offered 2 fellowships, postgrad fellowships.
Okay.
One was to study nuclear physics, and guess what the second one was?
Tell me.
Classical piano.
Good Lord, okay.
Yes, this is how good Raja Ramanna was. And till the day he died, he was giving concerts with classical piano and with the veena. You know, the man was truly eclectic in his abilities. Now, he was told by his father, don't be silly. There are no dark-skinned classical pianists in 1948 or 49 when he got his degree. Go and study nuclear physics. He studied nuclear physics, made an atom bomb. Okay. You cannot say that a person like that is not competent. It's the same thing with the Chinese. They were accused of all kinds of espionage, but they built their bomb on their own. They got some help from the Russians, they built their bomb on their own. Okay? And now, with all the sanctions on the Chinese, they came out with the Huawei Mate 60, which is probably one of the better cell phones out there. So they are investing in basic science. They are putting money into it in very large amounts, which India cannot do and India will not do.
Right.
And India, if you look at it, it tries, but these things sort of get caught up in government bureaucracy and lethargy. In the early 90s, India set up a department of robotics. Have you seen an Indian robot?
Indian?
Robot.
I've seen a couple of them.
A couple of them. But do they come?
But they seem pretty ancient to me.
Very, very rudimentary, not very good, can't compete with the German, Chinese, South Korean robots. Okay? But you set that up 30 years ago. What happened in those 30 years? The Chinese moved ahead very fast. Because they'll sit down and say, how much money do you need, Ramananda, to make workable robots? Say, I need $1 billion. Okay, done. In India, we do what I like to call banya accounting. Ramananda, why $1 billion? How about I give you 250 million? And then maybe we'll see. And the maybe we'll see never happens.
That's a bit, tragic since that is the case, because the impact is difficult to measure in many ways. But since we were talking about China, there's this war which has gone beyond a trade war between China and the US,
Right.
which probably is an ideological war right now more than anything else. And India has been drawn into that for whatever reason, because we have our own problems with China. And so I believe the West considers us as a sort of a counterweight to China. India doesn't like being called a counterweight, believes that, it's a power of its own.
Right.
But if it is an ideological kind of a war, why is it that certain countries are aligning differently with various other countries? Do you think India has made the right choice by aligning with the anti-China kind of a lobby?
See, I would have no problems if India was seriously aligned. But India is aligned in the way it does everything in foreign policy, which is
Right.
Monday, Wednesday, Friday we're aligned, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday we're non-aligned. Sundays, hey, it's the day of rest, so don't make me make a decision on that day. Nobody takes you seriously.
Okay.
I mean, let's be absolutely blunt about this. And I'll point this out. The Americans are really worried about losing unipolarity. And multipolarity is coming.
Right.
And it's coming far quicker than anybody else would think. Two, the Americans would like a militarized India which is ready to take on the Chinese. The problem with that is they're not going to give the money or the technology. Okay? And the other problem is then India's got to be ready to fight the Chinese to the last Indian, much in the way as the Ukrainians are fighting the Russians to the last Ukrainian, which I don't think anybody in India has any interest in doing. So this idea that you are some kind of ally is not there. Look, the serious alliance is not the Quad, and if you like we can talk about that. The serious alliance for the Americans is AUKUS, Australia, United Kingdom, United States.
Right.
And the Australians have been given will get nuclear submarines.
Absolutely.
Which may cost about $90 billion. The real problem is the Australians have also said we're not going to fight in a war to defend Taiwan. To which my question then is, why do you need nuclear submarines to run circles around Australia? Which probably is what they want to do because it makes them feel good about themselves. They're not a serious military power. The British had an aircraft carrier, the Queen Elizabeth, and they had to pull 2/3 of the aircraft because they'd borrowed them from the Royal Air Force. Now go ask the Indian Navy, it's willing to borrow Indian Air Force Rafales, and they'll say our Chief of Staff will take a jump off the Vikramaditya before he did that. It's not a serious alliance. But my question to you is, why is it 3 white countries are determining the security architecture of the Indo-Pacific? There used to be a word for this. It was called colonialism. And you have to think beyond this. It's not coming out of Washington. They don't trust India in terms of tech transfers. They're not going to give you subsidized weaponry in the way they give the Israelis. And they will always have restrictions on what you can do and you can't do. For example, think of all these problems India has faced with legitimizing its nuclear program. And on the other hand, look at how nobody in Washington, D.C. ever talks about the Israeli nuclear program. And 2 Israeli junior ministers have said, well, we should use nuclear weapons in Gaza, which, by the way, would be genocide, because you'd largely be killing civilians.
Absolutely, yes.
The minute they say that, they're admitting to nuclear weapons. The minute you're admitting to nuclear weapons, you violated American non-proliferation laws. Why is this not being brought up in the US Senate and saying you violated the Glenn-Symington Agreement? Because your average American politician has I Heart Israel t-shirts. They don't have I Heart India t-shirts.
Right.
Right. There's no emotional ties to India. There's no cultural ties to India. And they don't trust India as an ally.
You're saying that even with the diaspora punching above its weight, it's still not a big factor right now.
No. And yeah, I mean, look at the diaspora. The one person in the diaspora who I appreciate only for one reason is Vivek Ramaswamy, because he hasn't changed his name. He hasn't become Vivian Ramaswamy
Right.
or Vivian Ram
or whatever,
right? Namrata Randhawa goes by the alias Nikki Haley. Piyush Jindal goes by the alias Bobby Jindal. Why? And they both became Christians.
True.
Right? Vivek Ramaswamy is a good Tamilayer, so I'll give him credit for that. Why?
But he's still a Bible thumping kind of a thing, but that's more politics than anything
but he
else.
calls himself a Hindu.
Right.
And I'm not saying this to give a Hindu pitch here. I'm saying this, why do I have to change my identity to suit you? And if you look at it, I think Indian men have lost the script on this in the United States. Indian women are very good at this. There's two Indian women who I admire for this. One is Mindy Kaling. She's the actress who played Kelly Kapoor in The Office.
Right.
Okay, and the other is the chef and supermodel Padma Lakshmi.
course.
They both openly say now, we are Indian and we're also American. So they're not going with these stupid labels which people attach to Indians. East Asian Indian, what is that? South Asian American, Indian American. They're saying, no, we're Indian.
What about that lady who was the CEO of Pepsi or Coca-Cola?
Indira Nooyi, yeah.
Yeah. She
You
still
knew
retains her.
Yeah, what did you think of her?
She still wears a sari and is quite proud of her Indian roots.
Yeah. And they all go to Hindu temples. Yeah. So to me, this is the future of Indians. And when this group of Indians starts dominating American culture, society, and politics, you'll see the diaspora really play a much stronger role than what goes on right now. I've said this before. The only reason you had Howdy Modi in Houston or wherever it was because the Prime Minister was a Gujarati. And the entire Hotel Motel Patel crowd showed up for it. If tomorrow a Bengali, which would be very nice, or a Marathi became the Prime Minister, this lot would be a no-show.
True.
And you know this as well as I do. They don't identify as Indians. They identify as Gujarati American, Telugu American. I had a Sikh American colleague who said, I'm a South Asian American. And I lost my cool and I said, that's a geographic identity, that's not an ethnic identity.
You know, you mentioned Sikh American. On a day that Jake Sullivan was in New Delhi,
Yeah.
you know, you had that guy in, what was his name, Nikhil Gupta, that guy who was arrested.
Right. The
He
alleged
was being brought
assassin.
into
Yeah.
New York to stand trial. And while we are still trying to work our way around the ISET thing, not much has moved on that, I'm told.
No.
It's just a piece of paper so far. Do you think that that part is sort of being used as some kind of pressure tactic on India, or is it just, I mean, the law taking its course there and not something else?
I'll be blunt. 6 Americans died when a Pakistan-sponsored terror attack took place in Mumbai in 2008. Now, there are American laws which say if an American is killed abroad in a terror attack, it becomes an FBI case. It's not a Pentagon case or the State Department, because they can't do anything. The FBI investigated it, traced it all the way back to Karachi, named suspects. Now, this was done in George Bush Jr.'s time. Neither Jr., Obama, Trump, or Biden has ever put sanctions on Pakistan to say, hand over the suspects. True? 6 people died. This is an alleged assassin, and it's an alleged assassination attempt.
Exactly.
So why has it taken this particular turn? It would be a good question to ask people in Washington, D.C.
I mean, you work for a Canadian outfit in some ways.
Yeah.
Canada too has been having a lot of issues. I mean,
It's, I'll tell you my Canada theory. This has been brought up because a section of the Sikh community in Canada is very vocal, and they're a very dependable vote bank for the Justin Trudeau Liberal Party.
right.
So they come out and say this, and Trudeau and company obviously play to their vote bank, much in the way that American presidents played to the Cuban vote bank in Miami. If you have to win Florida, you have to win the Cubans. If you have to win New York, you have to win the Jews.
Right.
So that part of it is there. Now, I've been writing about this tongue-in-cheek. Now, I do want to write it in a Canadian newspaper saying Canada is a wonderful country. It's so kind to minorities. It likes to do conflict resolution, which is true, by the way. Every time Quebec has called for independence, they've said, have a referendum. If you get 50.5%, you're gone. But they've never threatened the Quebecois with, we'll kill you all, we'll impose martial law, anything like this. Now, the northern part of Canada, which is northern Ontario, northern Quebec, has been made into an autonomous province called Nunavut, because largely the population there is indigenous Canadians. Now, if you can do that, why not take a chunk of Canada and make it the autonomous province of Khalistan and give these people the identity
People keep
they want?
saying that, but yeah,
Yeah.
that is a thing. But we were talking about China and the US. India and the US, where do you see this trajectory going?
I'd say two things. Number one, there are lobbies in both countries, and I don't want to get into that, who are pushing defense as the big issue. To me, it's a non-issue. To the two countries, their political systems and the global political objectives are so different that you can't have large-scale political cooperation. America wants unipolarity, India wants multipolarity. Well, you tell me, where is the common ground in that? On climate change, we don't have common ground. I can go down the International Criminal Court, you have common ground. Big deal. So I think that's the part there which you should forget. The other part which is very insidious about this lobby is they are now talking about things like, why don't you lower Indian liability laws so we can sell nuclear reactors to India? To which my answer is, last year, and I've given you the photograph, which
I remember, yes.
Please do use it. Last year I went to Union Carbide in Bhopal. Okay? And if you see the building, it's probably about the size of this building. It's not a big building. But in the first week after the explosion, 4,000 Indians died. In the long term, another 16,000. That's 20,000 Indians die. That's 5 times as many people killed between the Iran-Iraq wars. No, sorry, the Iraq and Afghanistan wars for the United States.
If you put them together, yeah.
If you put them together. So why would any Indian in their right mind say we're going to lower our liability laws? Because we have 20,000 dead to show you. And you started a war, a 20-year war, when you lost 3,000 citizens in 9/11. And which was completely understandable, by the way. I think going to war then made sense. But you can't ask India to lower its liability laws. So what you can do with India is limited. I think there's 4 places where huge India-US cooperation can take place and should. The first one is Indian students in US universities. Just keep increasing the number of Indians who want to go there. Flip side of that is, in the Obama administration, the Indian government signed an agreement to build 200 community colleges in cooperation with the United States in India. Community colleges would be polytechnics, which produce plumbers, electricians, so on. You create the self-employment which you need to generate in India. So that's one. Second one is Bangalore and Silicon Valley, which I don't need to really get into. The third one is the Indian diaspora in India. And it's not just the diaspora in the US, which really doesn't send that much money back, even though they are the richest diaspora with a median household income of $130,000. India's diaspora, which is what, 25 million or 30 million, I forget the exact figure, sends back $100 billion a year to India. And that's more money than Shaktikanto Das can get through whatever economic policies the Reserve Bank of India is pulling. This is coming because Indians are sending money to their relatives, they're buying houses in India, you name it. Okay, they're investing in the country. Why not look at how to deal with these people? And one thing I've said is, there's an entire bunch of elderly, educated Indians whose children have left home. And you know this as well as I do. Indians don't play golf. That's a white American passion. Indians don't do that. So they're sitting at home bored. But these are robotics experts, IT experts, surgeons. I can go down the list on this, big name lawyers. Think of if you brought them to India and used them to educate Indians.
I remember you raised that at the last discussion.
One too,
that was an interesting thing. We seem to be running out of time, so I'll quickly ask you one more question on this before we move to Russia and China. One is that, the US seems to have this philosophy where I will sort of lecture you on human rights and all kinds of other issues, but at the same time I will do business with you. Okay, so it's not necessary that that becomes a friction point in some ways. It might be, but that's how the system. Now, do you think that is sort of applicable now to India as well, with all these senators writing that Indians will be punished for trying to kill an American citizen or whatever it is?
I would ask the US one simple question. You want to penalize India for an alleged assassination attempt. And this hasn't gone to court yet. When once things go to court, you and I know cases fall apart
Absolutely,
rather
yes.
rapidly. Okay. What have you done to penalize Israel, which has killed 34,000 women and children in Gaza? Okay. They get a free hand. Remember, after 2008, India was told exercise restraint. Manmohan Singh government was told exercise restraint. Nobody's told Netanyahu to exercise. Well, yeah, it's just like you slap Netanyahu on the wrist and say, bad Netanyahu. Okay, it's like you tell your child, bad child, you ate too much ice cream. You know that it's not serious. He knows that it's not serious.
No, but, you know, that would be the same whataboutery as saying that, you know, if the Americans can go and kill Osama, what the hell, why can't Indians do the same thing if there's a problem?
Yeah.
That whataboutery kind of a thing does work. And India, I mean, I'm not saying India has done anything so far, but India should certainly reserve the right to do so. If the host country cannot handle anti-Indian, you know, propaganda or whatever it is that is going on in the other country.
I'll just say one thing there very quickly. An Indian Air India Kanishk jumbo jet was exploded over the Pacific Ocean. 340 odd people died, mainly Indians. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who always brag, we always get our man, the Mounties.
They botched that case up very badly.
It went on for 25 years. How does
spent a lot of money.
And they spent a lot of money. They kept changing the lead investigator. And eventually the guy walked. Right. Eventually the guy walked. Now, what should India do then? That would be my question to the Canadians. If your legal system doesn't work, should we sit and applaud and say, oh, well, this was great. The legal system took so long and it didn't find a suspect or it didn't reach a guilty verdict? Or should it do something else? And these are the questions to ask the Canadians, the United States. My argument would be a very simple one. If you believe that we are a democratic country, then you need to treat us with the respect you treat the British, the Germans, the French, the Israelis, the Australians. We're not a cut below them, where you treat us at the same level. And if a criminal from one of those countries had committed something like Kanishk, they would have been essentially on a plane back to Germany or France the next day. Okay?
Absolutely.
So until you can give us the same kind of respect, let's work with the other four things. And remember, there's 5 or 6 people in the Trump family who have businesses. You can have wonderful transactions with them.
So, you know, let's sort of close this with a couple of quick questions. One is, we've talked about China, but Russia, you know, people talk about long-term relationships, our dependence on it in terms of weapons, all kinds of other things, on which anyway the Americans seem to have a problem saying, we give you dual technology, you'll probably share it with them, and there's Jake Sullivan was here and he said, you have to give it to me in writing, that you will not share whatever it is that we give you. How big is Russia in terms of India's sort of, you know, is Russia a big factor for India?
I think Russia is very important because it gives you the technologies other people won't. I'll give you 2 examples. BrahMos, which is going to go into a hypersonic with BrahMos 2. You'll be one of 4 or 5 countries that has that.
Right.
But the second thing is, and I had this argument with somebody who said, why do we need the Russians? We can go with the Americans on the space program. I said, if that's the case, why are you negotiating to buy a new generation of cryo engines from the Russians?
Exactly.
Because the Americans won't give them to you.
True.
The second thing the Russians and the French allow you to do is use their weapons to deliver strategic armaments, nuclear weaponry. Okay. Today, your nuclear arsenal is air delivered by the Mirage 2000s. Presumably, it will be delivered by the Rafales at some point of time. You can use the Sukhoi 30s. I mean, it's a big aeroplane, so you could put anything under it. The Russians allow you to do that. They gave you the complete technology to the BrahMos.
Exactly.
And if you know people in DRDO, ask them this question, why could you not make it after you were given the entire know-how and the know-why? They couldn't reproduce it. This is a fact. But they gave you BrahMos. And now you're exporting BrahMos to the Philippines and who else. So I think the Russians are important in that sense. I also think Russia can be very important in a different way. Russian universities actually have, I think, about 300,000 foreign students. And you don't go to Russia to study Shakespeare or anthropology, but you can go to Russia to study engineering, computers, physics. I can go down the list of metallurgy. The Russians are very good with metallurgy. DRDO has major problems with metallurgy. So I think eventually it's this. Work with the United States in the civilian sector, healthcare, tourism, so on, wellness. Work with the Europeans on weaponry, work with the Russians on weaponry, and work with all three on education. That would be my solution to this. And ultimately ask this question. You want Indians to die on the India-China border? What's in it for us?
Right.
Okay? And I'll give you the what's in it for us if you like.
Yes, please.
1, declare Pakistan a terrorist state.
Okay.
Why not? I always say aim high. Okay. 2, give us a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. 3, make us a de facto member, not de facto, de jure member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Right.
Okay. So that's 3 for starters. And if you can't deliver, then we'll take this down to how many Trump Towers can you open in India. It's a win-win.
Let's close this with a interesting theory that somebody had come up with, and I was personally a bit startled when I heard it. One is that India is keeping its options open vis-a-vis its alliances, in the hope that someday, we could actually align with China and Russia and form an axis there, and we don't need the US. I mean, that kind of a thing. Do you see that happening, or some kind of a?
I don't understand the China policy. Does somebody in this country realistically think you're going to get back Aksai Chin? That one morning Xi Jinping will wake up and say, "Oh, India, I apologize for the evil perfidy of Mao. Here's Aksai Chin back, and here's all the territory around Galwan that we took." Anybody who believes that is naive. Not going to happen, right? Are you willing to expend a lot of money and a lot of military manpower to try and take back Aksai Chin? I don't think so. So where do you go with this? And I'll sum it up this way. 1, very much like the Japanese, tell the Chinese, we have serious territorial disputes with you. We're going to try and talk about this diplomatically. In the meantime, we will bolster our presence on the border, which is passive-aggressive in one sense. Flip side is, let's trade. And honestly, every time I travel on the New Delhi Metro, I think I've told you this, I always talk to the kids sitting next to me now, which cell phone should I buy? And invariably I get Vivo, Oppo, Xiaomi, and Poco. I think Poco is a Xiaomi.
Yeah.
Okay? I never hear Apple or Samsung. And if 70% of the cell phone market in this country is Chinese,
That's right.
does the common man in India actually think in terms of public opinion, I'll throw my Vivo or Oppo in the garbage bin because they have Aksai Chin? I don't think
Not
they
going to
care.
happen.
Not going to happen. It's the same thing with white goods like Hisense and so on, which every time you go to a store now, it's full of these things. So why not start talking pragmatically about this? And I would say one thing to the military and the media. There's sections of the military who are retired who say, "Oh, give us the chance and we'll take back the land that the Chinese stole."
Again, not going to happen now.
Again, not going to happen. And it would be worth asking who was in charge when the Chinese took that land. All the land around Galwan, the ridges. It's a good question to ask because unfortunately, when those sort of things come out in parliamentary reports, there's egg on the face of people who may be hiding on this fact.
Oh.
I'll leave it at that.
Let's close this because I really want to invite you the next time to talk about pop culture. I think that would be a fascinating thing
Please.
to work on.
Yeah.
Mix it with international relations, but let's see how powerful pop culture can perhaps change the world.
Yeah. Remember, Indian kids now are not listening to Taylor Swift. I mean, you've probably seen this with your children and your nieces and nephews. They're all watching K-pop, which I think is pretty cool.
Taylor Smith is being studied by all these business schools and all that
Right.
as a thing right now, but she's a
But they were studying all kinds of things. They were studying Lalu Yadav's management of the railways.
that too.
Just how well did that one go?
So football, you said no, but pop culture perhaps.
Oh, I'll talk on football too, if you like.
Okay.
On why football is not the national game of India, and it should be. Because till the 70s, more people were watching football domestically than cricket.
No, but we've exported cricket to the US. You're paying.
We have.
That's a big
We
thing
have.
for people here.
Yeah.
Thank you so very much. It was a delight, sort of, having you
Thank
with us.
you.
And I look forward to having you with us again.
Absolutely.
You know.
My pleasure.
That was Amit Gupta talking to us in his own inimitable way about India's foreign policy, challenges, opportunities, India's relations with the US, with China, with Russia. I do hope you enjoyed this particular episode of The Gist, and I look forward to having you with us the next time. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Till we meet again, this is Ramananda Sengupta signing out.